So welcome everyone for to this session of the History and International Security Speaker Series here at the Program in American Grand Strategy at the Sanford School at Duke. It's my great pleasure to welcome our guest all the way virtually from across the pond, Vladislav Zubok, who is a professor of international history at the London School of Economics, an expert not only on Soviet history, but on Cold War history, and also intellectual history in the Soviet Union, who's here to talk today about his new book, Collapse: The Fall of the Soviet Union, which is due out, I think, any day now, from Yale University Press. So hopefully when we are all go our separate virtual ways, you will all first make a pit stop at the bookstore of your choice to purchase Collapse. I usually have a physical copy that I can wave around, but unfortunately mine hasn't actually made it here yet. So we will make sure that the link to purchase it is in the chat, and hopefully you'll all be inspired by our conversation today to go and do just that. Before we start talking about this wonderful new book, I just want to mention two important AGS points for everyone on the call. The first is that if you are interested in participating in the Pearl Harbor Staff Ride, applications for that are still being accepted, so don't miss out on the opportunity to do that. And then finally, we will be co-sponsoring one final event this semester with Barry Weiss, a former staff writer and editor of the opinion section at the New York Times, How to Fight Anti-Semitism, on the 2nd of December at 6:30 p.m. in the JB Duke Hotel. So we hope to see you there, but you're all here to hear from Vladislav Zubok and about his book. Vlad, thanks so much for being with us. Thanks for braving the time difference, and welcome virtually to Duke.
Thank you, Simon. The book is actually out. I don't know if you see the sad face on the book somewhere in your bookstore. This is mine. So the UK is 1 month ahead of the United States, maybe for the first time in many decades on something. Okay. A few things to say. Well, first of all, many thanks to Simon for arranging it, an old friend and good colleague. A few ways to plug my book. Of course, it's the story of the end of the Cold War. Simon's book is about the year of danger, 1983. My book is about 89, 91. And at the end of my book, President Bush father, is not really sure when the Cold War ended. He congratulates American people in January 1992. That is just a few weeks after the end of the Soviet Union, by saying, by the grace of God, America won the Cold War. As January 1992. Another way to plug my book is, of course, it's the end of the history of the Soviet Union, spanning several decades. And many questions were raised after the end of this country. Was it doomed? Was it an evil empire? Was it a prison of nations? Any kind of reforms could have saved it or not. So it's also a bizarre story of the times when the West, particularly America, had a huge positive impact on so many Russians. It's a story of a liberal Western soft power. Well, we know it was effective on Poland, Hungary, and other Eastern European countries. But here you read about Russia, and many Russians on many different levels were prepared to listen to American advice and guidance. Finally, it's my personal story. Greg mentioned it. I mean, Simon mentioned it. And I was on a plane when I heard about Gorbachev's house arrest. I came to the Soviet Union on December 31st, 1991. That was the 2 days before the launch of critical economic reforms in Russia. So, I flew from the Soviet Union, I returned to Russia. And meanwhile, I stayed in Amherst, full disclosure, nothing wrong. My personal life was basically cut into two parts, under the Soviet Union and after the Soviet Union. And it's already, horribly 30 years. 30 years later. And that made me think about the story of the collapse, so my second part of my life. So if you ask me about sources, I've been collecting sources and evidence on this question for exactly 30 years and did many interviews with some participants. I met with this man, Gorbachev. I didn't have a chance to meet with another man on my left, Boris Yeltsin, but I met with his alter ego and interviewed him extensively, as well as some people from his entourage. So what I'm up to, very briefly, my conclusion is that Western policies, including Ronald Reagan's policies, did not destroy the Soviet Union. That may be a shock for some Americans who still fervently believe that it was Reagan. What did destroy the Soviet Union was a bad sequence of several things that were purely internal policies and politics. First, I write, came misguided economic reforms of Gorbachev's Perestroika. And it is a major paradox in the book, actually, if you manage to go through some economic details, that it was not Star Wars, not the Soviet military industrial complex, not even Chernobyl atomic catastrophe, not the drop of oil prices that bankrupted the Soviet state. It was a sweeping economic decentralization and creation of autonomous state enterprises and cooperatives by Gorbachev and his ministers. Quite soon, those enterprises and cooperatives stopped paying taxes and profits to the central budget. Thereby, they defunded the central budget. So the ruinous economic reforms were greatly aggravated by political liberalization. Gorbachev acted as an idealist. He wanted to motivate people to make them, again, as he believed, masters of their life. It worked to some extent, but even more, this new politics led to a cascade of separatist movements, most importantly, to what I call the Rexit, the declaration of sovereignty of Russia and the decision of Russian legislature that Russian laws are above the Union laws. So instead of suppressing the separatism, Gorbachev sought to complete it with a legal and political concessions, which only made the problem worse. The failure of Gorbachev's reforms, economic and then political, embittered many Russians, made their life more difficult, and propelled the popularity of Boris Yeltsin, who became Gorbachev's nemesis. Ultimately, it was Yeltsin and the group of ex-party members around him that turned Russian, that became Russian separatists, the party members who became anti-communists. And they played a pivotal role in dismantling the Soviet Union. The strange coup of August 1991 that ended in a fiasco of those who made them, gave power to Yeltsin and his entourage. So in the end, they were the people who dealt the final blows to the Soviet Union and took everything that they thought worthy from hapless Gorbachev, beginning with his nuclear button and ending with the Kremlin itself. We are all taught that empires fall, yet what was so extraordinary about the Soviet Union's fall was how it collapsed, how quickly, how much it was decided in the center, not on the periphery. The role of Ukraine in the Soviet collapse has been recently quite highlighted. But in fact, as I found out, the Ukrainian factor was not so central, just like the role of the Balts in their struggle for independence, with all respect to this struggle. For the Balts first, and for the Ukrainian nationalists later, the Russian tug of war in Moscow was a gift from heaven. A unique split in the center of the empire benefited their bid for national independence. Late Brent Scowcroft, the national security advisor to Bush, was on the mark when he recalled Yeltsin was maneuvering so that The Ukraine would be the proximate cause of the breakup of the Soviet Union. I mentioned two elements of great surprise, or something that surprised me when I worked on this book: Russian separatism against its own empire and state, Gorbachev's aversion to the use of force. Another surprising factor, I should add, was the search by all participants of the Soviet drama for Western, especially American, recognition, advice, and guidance. The Balkan Ukrainians did it with the help of their diasporas, more or less intelligently and with some effect. The Russians did the same thing, but rather blindly and naively. The most remarkable part of the story was the desire of both Gorbachev and Yeltsin to lean on the United States and follow its guidance and advice. To conclude, the West was stunned but relieved at the sudden disappearance of the nuclear superpower that threatened it for so long. Western politicians were fully aware that their policies did not destroy the evil empire. When former enemies, so long at their throat, suddenly became friends, almost at their knees, American politicians were predictably confused and incredulous. At no point they, almost all of them, had an imagination to think of inclusion of the Soviet Union into the Western orbit. Acting pragmatically, they still recognized Russia as a successor to the Soviet Union and the sole possessor of all Soviet nukes. That was the limitations of the post-Cold War order. I think I would stop at this and invite questions.
Thanks for that, and thanks for starting us kind of down this path. I want to ask you a few questions, and then of course we'll open it up to the audience, and folks in the audience, you should feel free at any time to raise your virtual Zoom hand, and we'll start the queue, and I'll work my way through it. But I of course can't resist myself exercising chair's prerogative for a little while and asking you a few questions first, Vlad. And my first is this: is it to you more striking that the Soviet Union collapsed, or the speed with which it did so? Because we always see, we're going back to Kennan, we're familiar with these predictions of kind of an inevitable collapse, and you of course move well beyond any of that. But is the story here that the Soviet Union fell apart, or is the real story how fast it did? You're muted. You are still muted. A few technical difficulties, folks.
Okay, because there was a function that I'm not allowed to unmute myself. You use your prerogatives pretty well.
This is how we do things here at Duke University.
Maybe you overstretched your role. Anyway, of course, it's the speed. Of course, it's rapidity of those things. And by the way, you mentioned Kennan. I use Kennan's quotation that I found in his notebooks around 1946, when after he wrote his long telegram, came to Washington and prepared for lecturing at Princeton. And there was striking quote. He said that, of course, containment can gradually mellow the Soviet power. We all know it, and yet this mellowing will be never complete. It will be a very slow and long process. But there's another scenario he wrote down, a quite unlikely scenario, and something not so directly related to containment. that is the complete collapse, just like as it was in 1919, 1920 with Russia. And I was struck by this quote because, of course, Kennan, didn't exactly witness the collapse of the Tsarist Russia, but we all know the civil war and extreme violence of that time, and then the collapse of the state, that Bolsheviks had to rebuild that state and rebuild, some say, the empire. So the fact is, this forecast is much closer to what really happened in 1989, 91. Nobody could predict, even Kennan, that the Russian elite, led by Yeltsin, would turn so hard against their own union, in a sense, that many in the West identified the Soviet Union with a greater Russia. And they were hugely surprised, including people in the White House, such as Bush and Scowcroft and others, when the Russians turned against this greater Russia with such demons. Now you have to unmute yourself.
We've been on Zoom for how long, and we're still playing this game. In your conclusion, you describe the process that you just discussed as a perfect storm with a hapless captain. The perfect storm being the situation economically, politically, socially in the Soviet Union, and the hapless captain being Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev. I want to kind of deal with those two in turn, because the perfect storm description resonates, I think, for most people. The description of Gorbachev as a hapless captain is somewhat different, I think, to how he's often perceived. So let's take the perfect storm part first. Is this to you an economic story about the real problems that the Soviet economy is having at this time? Is this a political story? Is this a nationalist kind of imperial story? What I'm trying to get at here is that you rightly said that this isn't about the Americans, right? This isn't about Ronald Reagan tearing down the Berlin Wall, and that point is an important one. Can you talk us through a little bit what is actually ailing the Soviet Union at this time?
Oh my, many things were ailing the Soviet Union. It was definitely a patient in need of major reforms, and those reforms were overdue for 20 years. And on the basis of these structural illnesses, most of people, when the Soviet Union, after the Soviet Union collapsed, most of people kind of readily concluded that it was doomed. And it was like a competition between those who said that Gorbachev did too little, too late, and those who said he did too much, too soon. He had to be more cautious. I do not belong to either school. It just surprises me that he was not the only captain. Of course, there was the head of the government, Ryzhkov, promoted by Yuri Andropov, the head of the KGB, and Gorbachev's powerful sponsor, who died. I mean, Andropov died very early, 1984. There were trials and errors during the process of economic reforms. What surprised me is normally when you proceed by trial and error, you take a step back and you assess what is happening. Is everything going well, not so well, or badly, or disastrously? What surprised me that at the end of 88 and 89, and later, of course, it became a perfect storm about 1990. Gorbachev and his team, his government at least, never did that. On the contrary, they suffered from what I explained to myself as a fear of turning back. And I said, that's interesting. It maybe for a historian, there's something there. And because I wrote about the 60s, I wrote about the failed reforms of the 60s, that resonated with me. And said those people had experienced a major failure of reforms before. So they came on stage with that assumption that either they go full speed ahead with this limited window of opportunity, or some forces of history, reactionary forces of history, would come back and crush this window that they had. The party, bureaucracy, new Stalinists, whoever. So this, for me, explains their reluctance to stop, look at what they were doing and correct their course. But nevertheless, I was often struck by how much they were in a hurry and head over shoulder into very risky experiments in economy, like granting sweeping autonomies to tens of thousands of state enterprises that never had an opportunity to exercise that degree of freedom before. And at least it needed some calibration, and that never happened. The response was always, we cannot turn back. We cannot turn back, full speed forward. I call Gorbachev a neo-Leninist in my book several times. And recently, I had an interesting exchange with Archie Brown, who wrote, I would say, several books about Gorbachev. And Archie told me, no, he was not a neo-Leninist. He had nothing to do with Lenin. He was a social democrat. I said, Archie, I don't mean him being literally ideologically Leninist. I say neo-Leninist. Lenin, for him, was a leader, a revolutionary that took enormous gambles, enormous risks. So not Leninist platform and his theory of imperialism, whatever, appealed to Gorbachev. What appealed to Gorbachev was this, guy who changed history so dramatically, despite high odds, and went ahead. But Gorbachev was a neo-Lenin until a certain point. And I would say at the end of 1989, maybe in conjunction with the collapse of communism of Eastern Europe, he stopped being neo-Lenin. He all of a sudden became very, very hesitant to proceed with the same time of boldness as he had done before. And then, of course, came his nemesis Yeltsin, who just took this role, and many Russians began to view him as that decisive leader. But unfortunately for Gorbachev, for Yeltsin, Lenin was an evil leader. He turned anti-Leninist. Gorbachev was anti-Stalin. I should say, always consciously, he wanted to dismantle Stalinism, but he modeled himself after Lenin as a historical actor.
So let's talk about those reforms that you mentioned. And the first thing that I was struck by was your invocation, the idea that they were sorely overdue, which of course makes a lot of sense given what we know from reading your book is going to happen. But can you talk a little bit about, one, why that reform process was so overdue, and two, why it took the form that it did under Gorbachev and his coterie, right? Because there were various policy choices that could have been made to try to address the issues that the Soviet Union faced that you laid out. So why did it take until Gorbachev? And why did it take this sort of peculiarly Gorbachevian form that you just laid out?
Well, how much time do we have? It looks like it could be a major strategy game, with teams. One team arguing for a more conservative type of reform, another playing Gorbachev's team. I don't have the luxury of time. I should say neither did Gorbachev, since he proceeded so rapidly and without looking back. So why took 20 years to wait until or 15 years rather, to wait for Gorbachev to launch reforms? Well, we know that was a period of so-called stagnation. Most importantly, because the leadership that came to power had no imagination and no vision for reforms. And that plagued the Soviet leadership until Gorbachev came. So the first thing that comes to mind, how could this guy, after this long period of hesitation when the word reform was not used even, how could he come up with a striking, bold set of reforms? Maybe the answer can be found in, I don't know, the psychology of that generation of Gorbachev. Most of people are, I think, in a hurry to conclude. Well, most of people who analyze a moment of Soviet history, they in a hurry to conclude that there was huge economic pressure on Gorbachev to proceed. And then they come up with all kinds of factors. Yegor Gaidar mentioned falling oil prices, the crushing burden of the military expenditures. The Reaganovs immediately would say, yes, we crushed the Soviet Union by unbearable military expenditures. I found none of that. Yeah, the situation was, how to say, it was stably bad. It was bad, but stable. The military expenses stayed like this for years and years and years. 15% of the GDP, that's a lot. It was in part very wasteful, but at the same time, you compare the waste of American military-industrial complex with the waste of the Soviet military-industrial complex. And, we have to be more critical and self-critical. There was much more waste on the American side. The Soviet system, in other words, had its own inbuilt, abilities to make more bang for less bucks. Yeah, fewer bucks, I would say. So inherent, advantages, at least in American talk, in the security circles of the United States, they never could understand how such a poor country, otherwise so alien, so problematic, could produce such a powerful military-industrial complex. And definitely that was a little bit of an enigma for them. How does the Soviet Union finance all this? How they managed to produce all these huge, bulky missiles aimed at the United States? Well, the Soviets did it. The Soviets did it. It was a superpower. Yes, it was a very poor, very inadequate, very one-dimensional superpower, but it was a superpower. And but this cost did not break the back of the Soviet Union. So you go through, Chernobyl comes up. Many people now, after watching the serial about Chernobyl and reading Plokhis books, said, this is Chernobyl. No. Chernobyl cost the Soviet budget 10 billion rubles. That was mentioned in the documents. But the anti-alcohol campaign cost even more. And it didn't destabilize the budget. The Soviet Union, in a sense, had its unique financial system. One of the surprises of Gorbachevian reforms was that it not only knocked the economic pillar from the temple of Soviet stability, which I described a little bit, like, the defunding of the budget by increasingly wayward economic enterprises. It destabilized the finances, and the finances was, a rather different kind of system, but very, in a sense, very stable system. The Soviets were proud of their finances. Unfortunately, the ruble was not convertible to other currencies, but that was its strength internally. And when Gorbachev, with his reforms, moved the ruble out of its zone of comfort, so to say, the idea was to make the ruble fully work. Instead, the ruble zone was undermined, and the ruble was destroyed. It wasn't hyperinflation in 1991, but it was getting close to it.
So let's talk about the captain of this leaky ship, as you say. So I think one of the absolute first people who came and presented as part of this series was Bill Taubman to talk about his biography of Gorbachev. And he, I think it's fair to say, comes away with a much more positive impression of the last leader of the Soviet Union. And so I want to invite you to expand on your, holding account of Gorbachev's and his team's missteps, and ask you to evaluate, I guess, the sense to which it seems to you that they understood what they had unleashed. That is to say, were they out of touch with reality, with the Soviet reality of the time, or were they just ignoring the facts that were to them inescapable?
Well, it's not easy to speak about Gorbachev, because Gorbachev is famously difficult to categorize, and that Taubman begins his book with this question, famous question, and a quote from Gorbachev himself: "It's difficult to understand Gorbachev." So that since Gorbachev was central to my book, although he was not the only actor, there were many, including Yeltsin, and I had to deal with this difficulty. He was an idealist, a kind of a romantic. It's hard not to call him a romantic when you discover how much he rhapsodized about Lenin and the revolution. So he was not afraid of a revolution, unlike many leaders around him, let's say, or before him. He thought he would manage chaos. He enjoyed this chaos, viewing it as a positive chaos, thinking even in early 1990 that, okay, the Berlin Wall is gone, communism in Eastern Europe is gone, workers are on strike, hundreds of thousands of them, economy is not in great shape. Western banks stopped giving the Soviet Union a longer-term credits or medium-term credits. This is fine, but still, we're going in the right direction. We're going in the right direction. And the more things domestically stopped working in the way he expected them to work, the more Gorbachev switched to foreign policy. And that's an amazing story. I mentioned it briefly in my introduction, but he, and many authors write about it. But when I would compare my book with Taubman's book, I would say only one thing. In Taubman's book, when you read it, there's a chapter about domestic failure, and there's a chapter about foreign policy success. So Taubman divides, as if Gorbachev acts on two arenas, but not simultaneously. The reader cannot get the idea of him acting simultaneously, because first you read about domestic events in 1989, and then you switch completely to foreign policy in 1989. For me, it's artificial. I try to look at Gorbachev as, yes, increasingly playing as a world statesman on an international arena, but at the same time losing his country and losing his reforms, and how it affected his performance on a global arena. I never, of course, say that Gorbachev came to the situation when the West bribed him out of Germany, bribed him out of Eastern Europe, but I do see him losing ground. and coming with every new meeting with George Bush, with every new meeting with Helmut Kohl in Germany, coming with a weaker position. And most strikingly, the Western politicians realized how quickly he weakened himself. And already in April 1990, Kohl and Bush quite openly share their ideas about how to support Mikhail, because he may be gone and he's a very useful partner, and you need to do something to keep him in his job as long as possible. But the reader in Taubman's book never asks the question, what is the connection between domestic failure and foreign policy progress? I think I raised this question, and my answer is Gorbachev always wanted to change the Soviet Union and the world. In the end, as he proceeded, he encountered huge changes in the Soviet Union, but not the changes he liked. He lost control of those changes, and he switched his energy and attention to changing the world, at least in his own mind. So you read the dramatic descriptions, and there are many, of Gorbachev's resignation, and he's not addressing his countrymen. He's telling his countrymen something, but he addresses the world. And the people who beamed his address to the world were only Americans around him, CNN and ABC.
I like the point about the global aspect of Perestroika, because of course the book Perestroika that Gorbachev publishes, the subtitle is "For My Country and the World." It's immediately sort of framed as an international project. I think we need to do justice to the image behind you. I can't let you go without us talking a little bit about sort of the famous contest between Gorbachev and Yeltsin. You talked about Western leaders, West Germany, and in the United States, who were seeing Gorbachev lose power, lose control, and trying to take some of it from him. But probably few, if anyone, gobbled up as much of that lost power as Boris Yeltsin in the pack. Can you, in the background there, can you talk a little bit about that relationship and the role that it played in the collapse of the Soviet Union?
Yeah, before I do, I see some raised hands, and I wonder if these.
So we'll get right to those.
Yeah, some of these people may actually start writing in the chat room. That would save time and perhaps would allow me to answer more of these questions. It's just a suggestion. You're the host. Well, I think what's striking about Yeltsin is that in the fall of 1989, well, in September, he went to the United States, not his first trip, but first trip in a different capacity as a sort of downcast, as a heretic, as the former Politburo leader evicted from the Politburo, and Americans are in total control of his trip, but he's a free man. He feels as a free man in a country that he learns. And he came back from the United States with not only a supermarket shock. He saw American supermarkets, and he saw even more importantly that they are for everyone, even for poorest Americans who could afford to buy food there, unlike in the Soviet Union. But he came with a new kind of almost a new ideology. He wanted to model America. And around November, December 1989, under the impact of that trip, and maybe under the impact of the fall of communism in Eastern Europe, Yeltsin came up with this radical idea, very radical idea, if you think about it, to be a president of Russia, not the president of the Soviet Union. So nobody believed him at the time. Everybody thought that he was competing with Gorbachev for Gorbachev's position, and Gorbachev became the president of the Soviet Union in March 1990. No, he was absolutely sincere. He would say, the future is Russia. The future is Russia. So if you look for the pivotal personal event in their feud, that made their feud so fatal for the Union. It is this choice. And Yeltsin never wavered from that goal that he created for himself in the fall of 1989. Gorbachev's mistake was that he thought I would allow him to run for presidency of Russia. He would become a president. He would satisfy his ego and quest for power. No, it didn't work out. Yeltsin was determined to take Russia out of the Soviet Union. And in the Yeltsin archive, I found the list of demands to Gorbachev in August 1990, a striking list when essentially Gorbachev still had the army, the KGB, all the machinery of the statehood, and Yeltsin had nothing. And he had a list. And the list included everything on the territory of Russia, all nuclear power, nuclear weapons, in the Kremlin, in Moscow as a capital. I mean, he wanted everything. What would be left to Gorbachev? Gorbachev, of course, was speechless. And, there was no middle ground between them as long as Yeltsin held to his ground, I should say. Now we should open.
Yes,
really
we
open.
should indeed. As you rightly say, we've got a good number of folks. I'm going to start with the folks who are going to come live and pose their questions, and then we can work our way through the questions in the chat. And the first one in my list is Ania Krilova.
Hi, Vlad. Hi, Simon. Thanks for organizing this event. It is actually a great pleasure to ask a question in virtual person. I think actually asking questions through chat, it just adds another layer to our completely disconnected being nowadays. So congratulations, Vlad, with this wonderful book and with your brevity to offer a counter-master narrative, right? And I can completely share I share your sentiment that it is exceptionally difficult to talk about the end of the Soviet Union in the context, like in the West, in the context of pre-existing narratives and set images of Gorbachev, of the Soviet Union as being kind of doomed, as being programmed to collapse from somehow 1970s. So I'm very much, I'm very sympathetic, and based on my research, I'm very sympathetic with your kind of master account. But I have some questions about kind of details and some questions about that I really want to clarify. So my first question is about also it's I'm going to be like I've just read Mikhail Kuprianov's question. So my question actually is relates to his question. It's about this idea you mentioned that that the Gorbachev team actually never looked back, they never recouped, they kind of moved on, and they moved through all those disasters, kind of one act of mismanagement after another act of mismanagement, and then moving forward. So I have a question about that, because my understanding of the situation was actually the Gorbachev team broke down within the first 2.5 years after he formed the team. And in particular, Nikolai Ryzhkov actually did spend, let's say, like a year and 2 months trying to work on a different and alternative economic plan that actually first was supposed to allow the country to step back, recoup, and then move forward. And his plan actually was, he worked with the Institute of Economics that was headed by a Balkan, right? So there was actually, to me, that was very reassuring to learn that there were people in the Soviet government who understood since 1987, 88, that the road was paved towards collapse, economic collapse, and therefore the collapse of the whole situation. So what happened between Gorbachev and Ryzhkov? Because Ryzhkov wrote his own autobiography, it's memoirs and autobiography. So he actually wanted, he is deadly and not favorably inclined to Gorbachev, right? He actually holds him personally responsible for mismanaging and causing the collapse in the end. So this is my first question. And my second question, much shorter, is about Gorbachev as helpless captain. I actually like this term. I think that what is really fascinating about Mikhail Sergeyevich is not only that he mismanaged the situation and kept mismanaging it ongoing, kind of in an ongoing manner, is that sometimes it looks like he didn't have a concept what management is. And he didn't have a concept what actually strategy is and how many steps it takes, how many years it takes in order to carry out just if we just want to change the economic kind of sphere of the Soviet Union, right? But he also added political, he added transnational, international, right? He also, so he had did he have a concept of management? And in that way, and I'm asking this question because I'm not sure that he can be compared to Lenin, because Lenin, apart from his political agenda, was a very good strategist. And he actually could calculate like hour by hour, step by step, what actually needed to be done. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Anna. Wonderful questions. And where should I begin? No, I don't compare Gorbachev to Lenin. No, I was struck how much he himself thought of Lenin before doing anything. The result was, yes, mixed. You wonder how selective his image of Lenin was. But then Chernyaev writes, his foreign policy aide writes how much Gorbachev was shocked in early 1989 when he read Solzhenitsyn's pamphlet about Lenin in Zurich. And Gorbachev was deeply shocked by a new image of Lenin as being a destroyer of the Russian state in that pamphlet. And he had continued to impersonate Lenin in front of totally stunned Chernyaev, like an actor, acting for half an hour, basically mimicking Lenin's accent. And so there's something to this, a self-comparison, not sure, I expressed it clearly, but it deserves maybe a special and more detailed treatment. In terms of hapless captain, I use this image a lot because at some point it seemed to me, particularly since May 1989 and definitely during 1990, the crucial year, in my opinion, for the fate of the Soviet Union, that Gorbachev was not only a captain without the sense of management, as you said, not only a captain without the sense of even direction, because ironically, we all know the story when, young captain was steering his ship towards Latin America and ended up in Angola, right, by mistake. So that was very much how I was thinking about Gorbachev, not really knowing that his ship was not going to something positive, but actually going to a waterfall of sorts, or to very wrong coast, very dangerous coast, and not the coast of utopia, not the coast of, positive things ahead. And at some point, Gorbachev kind of looked at the passengers who were petrified by the course of the ship over the heads of Ryzhkov and other members of his government. Said, so guys, what should we do next? And that's, of course, you can say it's a flippant image of Gorbachev, but it is documented repeatedly by endless discussions that Gorbachev put together. He was like an ideal seminar leader. He would invite all these members of the Politburo, then Presidential Council, then Security Council, then, all members of the government, foreign experts. And he even invited sometimes, a whole group of workers came from the Kuzbas. He invited them as well to this seminar, and everyone raised a hand, everyone spoke, and poor me had to read through all of this. And then at the end, you would expect that Gorbachev would say, so comrades, okay, enough with all this empty talk, we should do this. Particularly in August 1990, when Gorbachev had a 500 days program on economy, and a number of other interesting things that I mentioned in my book. And instead, Gorbachev comes up with a proposal, let's discuss it more. So how you cannot come away with this image of a hapless captain that wants passengers themselves to figure out the course for the ship at the time when the ship was, already approaching dangerous reefs. On the question of economy, I see, and I read Mikhail's excellent question. It was the time of incredible economic programs and pamphlets and economic imagination. And somebody should write about this story of Russian economic imagination of 1990 and how far was this imagination from reality. Sometimes, you almost read like Dostoevsky's Podrostok, I don't know, the adolescent, when you read these pamphlets. Oh boy, another so-called economist comes from Narod, from the people, to explain to everyone how Soviet economy can be saved. But they were serious people. They were serious people. I found Nikolai Petrakov, such a person, who presented a wonderful plan to Gorbachev, a strategy, real strategy, how to move, how to deal with financial disbalances, how to deal with the market, how to deal with all these questions. I mean, it's a little bit over my head, the macroeconomic logic of Petrakov's plan, but I checked with people at of all places, the Hoover Institution, and one of them, my wonderful mentor, Mikhail Bernstam, said that was a brilliant plan and some ideas that didn't even enter into our heads at that time. And Bernstam was a Hoover advisor to Yeltsin later on, economic advisor. So I think that such plans existed, but Gorbachev said later, oh, he liked the story that Baker told him. Reagan used to joke that an economist should have only one arm. Why? Gorbachev said, because Reagan responded to Baker, because they always come and say, on one hand, on the other hand. So one-armed economists were clearly missing in the Soviet Union. But in my view, of course, that says a lot about Mikhail Sergeyevich. None of the top Soviet leaders knew much about economy, not to mention macroeconomic analysis. It's quite understandable. That shouldn't be blamed on him. What is, however, clear in retrospect, I stress in retrospect, that Ryzhkov's reforms were the first nail in the stability of Soviet economy. This is why I call them misguided. They fulfilled the dream of the people of the 60s, шестидесятники, more decentralization, more autonomy to state enterprises, but they did it in such a way that defunded the central budget, that broke down the chain of supply, that created that strange process of hollowing out of the existing economy from within. All of a sudden, directors of enterprises became, the destroyers of those enterprises, because they were interested in taking out of those enterprises and selling. Plus, they got from Ryzhkov and Gorbachev something that never dreamed of: the freedom of foreign trade, licenses. I mean, why the Soviet Union, the richest oil economy after Saudi Arabia, was without oil, without gasoline? Why foreign aircrafts could not be refueled in Sheremetyevo in 1991? Because, the state enterprises, including some of people we now know as Russian oligarchs, they got those licenses to sell oil abroad for a entirely different price. And there were no state controls. The failure of central controls is astonishing. So I would repeat, Gorbachev, thanks to Ryzhkov's misguided reforms, lost any economic leverage. The Soviet central government lost financial leverage, so they completely out of control of what the state bank did. we all know other elements of this disorder: political liberalization, a glasnost destroyed the ideological certainties, and there was this parade of sovereignties. But usually the emphasis in the existing master narrative is on the parade of sovereignties and the last empire, and on glasnost, of course, and on political liberalization. Very few people understand that by that time, economic and financial stability were being undermined as well.
Thanks for that, and thanks for that great question, Anna. I see Eleanor Ross has been very patient with her hand up, and I want to invite her to ask the next question of our guest.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. I think we're really all honored to hear from you and be able to ask questions from you. I just wanted to ask about Gorbachev's Perestroika campaign, and if you think it did improve the relations between the Soviet Union and the United States, even though that it did lead to the Soviet Union's eventual decline. Did the positives in terms of relationships with foreign countries outweigh, the negatives there?
Well, yeah, thank you, Lenora. This is what I try to do in my book, to see how foreign policy improvements speak to domestic failures. And this is not a simple story to understand, because most of Americans, they know the good part of the story, that the Soviet threat began to melt. There was more trust, first Reagan and Gorbachev, then after some period of uncertainty, Bush and Gorbachev, and so on and so forth. And then those who are consumers of this good story, then they kind of stop in astonishment, and then they say, hey, where's the Soviet Union? All of a sudden it vanished. Hello, the Soviet Union, stay here. We're building this new relationship. So Gorbachev definitely found himself in this position in the fall of 1991. He was lionized as the man who ended the Cold War. Everyone, including American leader George Bush, recognized him. He received the Nobel Peace Prize for his role in improving peace. And that included not only non-use of force in Eastern Europe, that included the unification of Germany and NATO, that included mostly non-use of force inside the Soviet Union. So, but they still have to answer the question, how the man who won the Cold War and greatly improved the relations with the United States and the West, how did he lose the country? At the same point, was it related causally, or there were, like, as Taubman, Bill Taubman writes in his book, were two different things. In my opinion, they were related. They were related. And in a sense, Gorbachev began to be in haste, in a hurry, after the collapse of the Berlin Wall, before he was negotiating with the United States, with Western Europe, about a pan-European architecture. That is, it's not only about the end of the Cold War, but about what kind of order would replace the Cold War and the competition between the superpowers. And his idea, as we all know, was a common European home, from Vancouver to Vladivostok, so that definitely includes the Soviet Union. After the fall of the Berlin Wall, this vision was clearly, if not in ruins, it was clear for increasing number of policymakers, serious people, that this vision would not come to be. At first, Bush and Kohl negotiated how to get the Russians out of East Germany and get Germany reunified. And I would mention, if you're interested, an excellent book by Mary Surratt that is coming out. The title is Not 1 Inch. So with much more details than in my book, but we're basically analyzing the same material. And the more Gorbachev was losing the ground, the further he was prepared to go, and faster, in terms of dismantling the Cold War debris he strongly believed that he ended the Cold War. In December 1989, at the summit with Bush at Malta, he said the Cold War is over. We no longer treat America as an enemy. So for him, the Cold War was over, but not for Americans. Not for Americans. They still had doubts. Maybe, if Gorbachev is replaced by someone, it will be another tough man or some kind of a dictator, and everything will go back. And it continues, and Gorbachev competes against time because his domestic affairs were going from bad to worse. He competing against time to prove to the West that he's genuinely prepared to go very far, that he's genuinely prepared to dismantle the Cold War, structures. And the irony, of course, Eleanor, the irony is that for many Westerners, particularly many Americans, the most important structure to be dismantled was the Soviet Union itself. So when this Soviet Union got dismantled, Bush comes out and says, by the grace of God, America won the Cold War.
So keeping with our foreign policy theme, I see a question in the chat from Felipe who asks you what role the Soviet war in Afghanistan during the last decade of its existence did or did not play in its ultimate collapse.
Well, I know there's some excellent books. You can read Artemy Kalinovsky's excellent book, Farewell to, long goodbye, how the Soviets were withdrawing from Afghanistan. In my, how Anna put it, my master narrative, Afghanistan plays a rather peripheral role. I don't see Afghanistan, just like Chernobyl, and other things that ail the Soviet Union. I don't see them as something that destroyed the Soviet Union. Gorbachev was very careful about withdrawing from Afghanistan. He waited for a long time, and then only in 1988 set the deadline for the withdrawal. And this withdrawal happened ahead of schedule, right, in February 1989. And then everyone in the West expected a quick collapse of the pro-Soviet regime. And it didn't happen. This regime continued through 89, 90, 91, and 92. And it was only American demand and Yeltsin's consent and Gorbachev's consent to terminate completely the Soviet assistance to the regime in Kabul that not immediately, but a year later caused the collapse of this regime to Taliban. So now we have a benefit of comparing Soviet withdrawal with American withdrawal. So I leave it up to you to make your own conclusions. Whose withdrawal was more gradual and more effective? But of course, in the end, everything is annulled by the disappearance of the Soviet Union. The United States naturally are not in the process of disappearing, and who cares who rules, who governs Kabul these days? But you can see also how important was Gorbachev's calculations in Asia. They were much more careful, I would say, and gradualistic than in Europe. Or maybe let me rephrase it, let me take my words back. Before the collapse of the Berlin Wall, Gorbachev thought there would be a more gradual process in Europe as well. But definitely didn't expect what happened in November '89. You may also mention Gorbachev acted very differently with regard to China. He was present in Beijing during the peak of the Tiananmen crisis and left shortly before the Chinese leadership cracked down on Tiananmen protest and killed many students in the process. But Gorbachev, of course, was aghast at the use of violence, but he never came out to speak to students. He never denounced the Chinese regime publicly after the Tiananmen crackdown, although so many of his advisors thought he should do so. He didn't do it because he valued the normalization of the Sino-Soviet relations after 2 decades of very dangerous crises and standoff.
So we've time for, I think, just one last question, and that comes from Jeremy Smith, who asks us to cast a glance beyond 1991 and to talk a little bit about the future. And I'm just going to paraphrase his question and ask you to talk a little bit about the historical memory and the legacy of the events of the Soviet collapse, which you detail in your book, and talk a little bit to wrap us up about how that event 30 years ago is still making itself felt in Russia today.
Well, it's a huge question, Simon. I noticed one person in the chat room wrote that the real story is peaceful collapse of the Soviet Union empire, including Eastern Europe. Yeah, I wish it was remarkably peaceful, but it's always the matter of comparison. Compared to what? Compared to what everyone expected at the time, a nuclear Armageddon or some kind of, total. There was a lot of violence. There was a lot of violence on the periphery of the Soviet empire. Some sporadic violence in the Baltics, and to my surprise, the suddenness of the Soviet collapse immediately led to a Russian-Ukrainian conflict. That I didn't expect to find pretty much everything that later on flared out. The Crimea, the deep insecurity of the new Ukrainian state, Russian desire to keep control of the Black Sea Fleet and other things right away. And it might be naive to say that with the more gradual process of devolution of Soviet power, with Gorbachev having his way of a voluntary union, it could have proceeded differently. We simply cannot say it. We simply, we're historians who register what really happened. But the suddenness of this collapse created that euphoria, of course, among many. And particularly in Ukraine, in the Baltic states, and the suddenness of their liberation from the empire was astonishing. They were astonished themselves. But at the same time, the lack of negotiations and lack of, let's say, habit of getting used to this created problems for the future. Just 2 words about how the Russian public opinion views this. It's a big question. To my surprise, there's much greater interest in my book in the West than in Russia. I wonder why. I gave a few interviews to Russian media about the August coup, but generally, I think they sort of many people bury their hand in the sand in a sense. Historically, they prefer not to face the enormity of this change. I'm not talking about evaluations, positive, negative, it can be anything, but the enormity of this change and the necessity to study it. Rather, they kind of they say, okay, it happened, and we don't want to read much about it. So it's an interesting psychological, political, historical phenomenon.
Interesting, it certainly is, and we're all in your debt for having written such an interesting and engaging account of it. Again, the book is Collapse, the Fall of the Soviet Union, available wherever books are sold. It remains only for me to thank all of you for joining us this afternoon, and above all to thank you, Vlad, for making the time to be with us. Thanks for joining us, albeit only virtually, here at Duke. And folks, we'll look forward to seeing you at future AGS events as the semester wraps up, and of course in the new year. Thanks very much to all of you for joining us.
Thank you, Simon. I have a dream to come to Duke live at some point.
I will look forward to hosting you.